Hello and welcome to Jibs Advisory Recruitment Discussion. As always, if you can hear me, please put a note in the chat box or the question box so it makes sure that we're not talking to ourselves. I've just been speaking to Paul Jacobs for the last 10 minutes and he was on mute, so he's been talking to himself constantly, as always, but there's nothing new there. This week, we are talking about reviews and how using reviews to motivate your staff, especially at this time as staff are remote and they're working away from the office. I always find that reviews are one of the most feared and hated, but one of the most forgotten processes in recruitment. But if done correctly, they can be one of the most productive and influential processes in the monthly calendar that drives productivity, achievement, and motivation in your staff. So put simply, managing and coaching is a process that aims to improve performance and focus on the here and now rather than the distant past or future. So while the different types of coaching and mentoring, what we've got to look at is what is considered to be a really good coach or manager during reviews and how they get the best out of their staff. So today we've been joined gladly by Heather. Heather is a renowned HR recruitment director. She's a non-exec for the directors, non-exec director for the REC. So she has got loads of experience within HR, and she's going to discuss with us today how to unlock the potential of your employees when they're working remotely, and we're going to cover loads and loads of topics. So Heather, I'd like to welcome you to the merry bunch of the Jump team. I'd like you to introduce yourself formally and properly before we get into the first conversation, which isn't about Paul Shart's jumpers, tight, loose, tight. It's about a methodology of training and developing and coaching your people.
Howard, thank you very much. I'm not sure renowned is a good word, but what kind of a reputation? That's good. Thank you. So yeah, I've been working in recruitment for about 20 years, both operationally running teams of people and in a HR L&D coaching and mentoring role. So huge amount of experience, and I'm really interested to join this particular webinar because getting feedback right is absolutely fundamental to the way in which we manage people and we get the best out of them. So fascinating conversation to come.
Good. Okay. So let's talk about tight, loose, tight methodology. This is a methodology we discussed the other week, and it was quite an interesting sort of article that you sent across to me. So let's expand that a little bit for the audience.
Yeah. So tight, loose, tight is a concept that comes from a coach called Mark Colgate. That's his name, Mark Colgate. And what he talks about is how important it is that we set up feedback by having a process. So feedback on its own isn't enough unless you've set it up properly in the first place. So the tight, loose, tight concept is saying if we have a very tight setup, so we have a conversation about clear goals, clear aspirations, and that's for your career as a whole, but also for your objectives, your desk, your business, whatever it is. Very tight setup, very tight goal setting, and a tight review process in the end, which is what we're going to talk about mainly today, is how you do that feedback piece at the end and how do you do the review. Then the piece in the middle can be much looser. So we're not micromanaging people. We are setting them up to succeed, and then we're allowing them to succeed, and we're giving them the space in which to succeed. So that's where the loose piece comes in. And the tight at the end is what we're going to talk about today, which is how do you do really good feedback and what does really good feedback look like? And that framework for me seems really sensible and also comfortable for managers, particularly when we're remote working. We're not sat with people every day. We're not looking over their shoulder. We don't see what they're doing. So finding a way that managers are comfortable with a loose piece in the middle can be really helpful, particularly in a remote working situation.
It's quite interesting when we talk about that tight, loose, tight. I always think if you've got that really tight bit at the beginning and you know exactly what you're doing, then what you're actually doing is you're delegating success down to your team, and it's them to then have that loose sort of framework to achieve that success in. And then obviously when you review that success, then you go back to that tight methodology to look at how you're measuring that success and working from there.
Exactly. And Howard, what you end up with then is genuine accountability. because your team members understand what is expected of them, and they own that performance. It's for them to deliver it, not for the manager to deliver it. So you get genuine accountability, which then drives motivation and performance.
So it's because it's quite interesting, because everyone's been talking at the moment about, you know, people working remotely, and it's such a strange anomaly that everyone's doing that. You know, no business has ever succeeded at that. And I keep mentioning people like, you know, the Avon company have been doing it for hundreds of years and have been very successful at it. Although, dare I mention, Ann Summers are doing it as well, and have had that sort of remote staff everywhere and have a huge, great culture, but have a very tight, loose, tight process with regards to what they do that drives their sales, which is why they've been so successful for that and working from there. So as we talk about that, we talked a lot about management versus coaching. And there's a very big difference between a manager and a coach and how they get on to review about that. So again, very interested in your sort of viewpoint on management and coaching and how that sort of the difference between the two.
It's a really interesting question, and one of the things I find really difficult is to remember what it was like to be a manager before I learned to be a coach, because I think once you've learned coaching and you've learned coaching techniques and styles and good coaching questions, it's almost impossible to go back to doing it any other way, because you learn very quickly the power of good questions, and the power of drawing responsibility and ownership performance from individuals rather than imposing it on them. And for me, it's all about those great coaching questions. Really is the only way I remember how to manage people.
Okay, so as we talk about that then, so give me an idea then, a difference between what a coach would do and what a manager would do, and the difference, and then we might bring sort of Paul Jacobs in to have another viewpoint on that.
Yeah, Paul, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on that.
Well, I actually, just before I get to that, I just wanted to come back to a point you were making around the sort of tight, loose, tight scenario. There's a lot of talk about, you know, the millennials, as we fondly term them, and you know, there's a lot of conversation, or has been over the years, that, you know, they seek different types of environments to older codgers like me, and I've always thought this is a load of rubbish, because I feel that when I consider what millennials want in the workplace, which is an open environment where their views are sought, where they have the opportunity to communicate, they are listened to, and so on, I don't see that as any different from the kind of workplace that I also appreciate. So I've always thought a lot of bunkum around things like that. But I'm interested in your view about whether we should be, as managers, as leaders, treating and managing younger people in perhaps a different way, or in your view, what do you think they're seeking from their leaders and managers that's perhaps different to the way in which maybe people like me were brought up?
I don't think it's different at all, Paul. I think people are people, and I think there's a lot of, as you say, a lot of bunkum talked about millennials. I think that what people want, all people of all ages want, is to be managed well, and I think tight, loose, tight gives you a framework for managing people effectively. Generally, people don't want to be micromanaged. Generally, people want to be accountable for their own performance, and they want to be involved in the decisions about their future. And I don't think that's any different, whatever age you are. Now, there are some other things that we need to understand about knowledge and learning and understanding of the world and context and all of those things that are going to be different based on somebody's age and cultural background and place in the world and all those sorts of things. But broadly, good management is good management, good leadership, whatever age you are in an organization.
So, and I agree completely with that point. And I think back to the question of how it's raised, you know, for me, you know, as we've always said, there's a huge difference between leaders and managers. We talk about that consistently. And of course, leaders are always about the we, and they're not pushing fingers in people's faces and dictating. And I think, you know, they talk about, we're doing this. It's a very collaborative use of language, because it's an inclusive environment. Leaders create that kind of inclusion, that kind of sense of belonging, whereas we know managers tell. And of course, I think that would you come back to this earlier question about what younger people, or indeed what most people want, they want to work in these inclusive environments, these family units, to feel part of the organization, to understand the vision and where the company is going. And it's, in my view, often the reason why we see people working for organizations, often startups, at less salary with fewer benefits, because they believe in the vision, they believe in the leaders, they're bought into the culture, and they're very much on that journey. They're absolutely hearts and minds involved in the organization, when they could easily walk away and work for a big corporation somewhere else and earn a considerable more amount of money and get better benefits. And I think that this leadership about the inclusion is essentially what people are seeking. Is that very much part of that tight, loose, tight concept that you were referring to earlier?
Yeah, I think it is. And on a very simple level, to come back to what Howard was saying about the difference between managers and coaches, it kind of feeds into that piece. And it's about not invented here. So if you're talking to somebody about their desk and you're setting goals for their desk for this week or this month or however long it is, and you tell a consultant what they're going to be, because you know you're a really experienced manager and you know what they should be, of course, because you've done it before, that individual's not bought into that conversation. Whereas if you're asking them, what do you think you should achieve this week or this month, and what do you think is going to impact that, and how do you think you can make sure you achieve that, and what might get in the way, and how are you going to deal with that? You're asking great questions for them to own, and that's the same at any age and in any context. And they then own the decision, they're accountable for the decision, they've agreed it, and they're much more motivated to achieve it with very much less checking in, because they own the outcomes.
I think I look on that, and Paul, because I think what you're talking about is that piece where it's about the accountability of the manager and the accountability of the person that's being managed and how that works. Now, when you start talking, I remember being a junior consultant, and I remember I had an annoying manager who would take everything off you, do it, and then deliver it back, and that took all away my autonomy. And I was used to sort of being absolutely doing everything else, and I love that autonomy. And I think what managers tend to do, they do take away tasks because they think it's quicker and faster for them to do, where actually what that does, it causes a bottleneck, because it means the manager's got so much more work to do and can't actually deliver that work. So I think that merely telling, and I think what I found when I started to sort of understand the difference between a good manager and a coach, it wasn't having the right answers for the people, it was having the right questions to ask the people to get them to the right answer and make them come out with the answers rather than the other way around. And it was having that sort of difference that created that bond and that trust between myself as the manager and that person as the employee, of asking the right questions to motivate them, ignite their thinking capabilities to be the catalyst of their future, and actually push their future, but give them the autonomy. And that is back to, although I'd never looked at it tight, loose, tight, I'd always looked at it in a slightly different way, but tight, loose, tight sums it up perfectly, that I was very tight on the way I managed them, but I gave them the massive autonomy to go away and achieve that.
Yeah, and trust, I think, is a word you used there, Howard, and it really comes back to that. And that's one of the things some managers have struggled with during lockdown, and with the needing to work more remotely and more flexibly. And tight, loose, tight gives you a framework in which to trust your staff. And one of the things that stops people delegating effectively is that they don't trust people to do it properly. But if you're setting it up in a tight way at the beginning, then you can trust them to go away and be loose in the middle, and you're setting yourself up for effective feedback at the end.
Heather, can I ask you a question? Because I am one of the great questions I used to use in interview, which has always stood me in good stead, was to potential employers, tell me how you like to be managed to get the best out of you. Should that now be replaced, or would it be better with tell me how you like to be coached to get the best out of you?
That's a really interesting question, Dave. I've used that question myself a lot. It is a great question. Honestly, I don't think I would change it, because I don't think most people have the word coaching in their vernacular. They
Right.
think about being managed, they don't think about being coached, and they don't really understand the difference. So I'm not sure if you ask the question, how do you like to be coached, they would think about it in any context other than on the football field or the rugby or the rugby pitch. So
Right.
so I think your question's brilliant as it is, Dave.
There you go, Dave. Someone said you were brilliant. That's a start point.
No, I said his
I'll take
question
that.
was
I've
brilliant.
done that. Bye.
That's his tick box sorted. So the question then sort of goes when we start talking about that coach and management scenario, whether we how we mix that word up. You know, the old adage of people don't leave companies, they leave managers, you know, is the difference between a manager who's that dictatorial manager to that coach who actually then, you know, creates that environment that people can actually blossom in, and they create an environment where people feel that they are being developed. We talked about this yesterday on a different scenario. We talked about how people feel comfortable about being in a safe place at work, where they feel they can express themselves without the fear of ridicule, about the fear of, you know, why have you done it that way, etc., etc. And that sort of leads to that sort of review format, and how that format then is sort of pulled together, and what that format should look like, especially when you're starting to work remotely, because that format then has to be a little bit tighter, but you're obviously now giving that looseness, absolutely, because you're not there every day from a coach or a management point of view. So let's talk about the review format, because I think there's so much to talk about in this subject alone.
Anybody want to volunteer to take that one?
I'll go if you want. So I think for me, I think just coming back a step, and you've got the slide there, Howard. It's just a question that I ask everybody is, you know, write your name down now. Just write your name on a piece of paper really quickly. And then as soon as you've wrote your name down on a piece of paper, put the pen in the other hand and write your name again. It's going to feel really awkward. It's going to feel, you know, not real. It's going to looks messy and everything else. It's the same thing with coaching and managing. And I think, Heather, your point there about, you know, why would you go back? I think it's about pushing yourself and doing something in a different way. It's going to feel really awkward to start with. It's going to feel not natural, and you're going to feel well out your comfort zone. But I think once you get there, then I think your analogy and your comment about not going back is really spot on. And I think this is about three things for me. It's about trying to create more time. So as a business leader, do you want more time? I haven't met one business leader that doesn't want more time. And the second thing I always ask is, do you want to be less stressed? And everybody, you know, would normally answer yes to that. And by moving into a more of a coaching style and using process and procedures around it, you can, one, free up more time, but it will take quite a lot of stress away. In terms of the process for me, I think it's about managing the individual and not the task. And I think sometimes we go into reviews with a mindset that pushes us down the being very directive route rather than facilitating and influencing. And what I mean by that is, you'll go into these reviews, you'll sit down with your people, and you're already thinking, you know, they've missed the KPIs this week, or they've not delivered the revenue last month, or they've not made enough calls, they've not had enough meetings. And equally, you might be equally conversely thinking the opposite. So you're going into that review with a mindset. And therefore, if you do that, then you start to manage the task and not the person. And the review process for me has got to be about managing the person. So you'll summarize, you'll ask them what they think, you'll use silence. What you won't do is give them instruction or advice or tell them what you would do or how you do it. Because if you're doing that, then you're fixing the task. You're managing the task rather than managing the individual. And I think if you manage the individual, you get an employee that is usually typically more highly engaged, they're more motivated and bought into the challenge, they're inspired, they feel self-fulfilled. And we shared a fact before Christmas, didn't we? I think it was Harvard said that 2/3 of employees are disengaged by being told what to do. So it's a real key driver, this. And if you then think about the industry, you know, we're gonna go on a growth pattern soon. There'll be more people wanting to hire, and you're gonna have to keep all your existing people. If you're not engaging with people in the right way and making them feel empowered and motivated, they're all gonna leave.
I would just inject a slight note of caution in there, though, that if you're suddenly changing from managing the task to managing the people, you can really discombobulate people.
100%.
It's really worth thinking about that. And I remember the very first term I worked for a guy called Tommy, who turned out to be the best manager I'd ever had. But the first meeting I had with him was utterly terrifying. I was about to go and do, I think it was my first disciplinary meeting in my first it wasn't even called HR then, it was called personnel. And I said, okay, so what do I do? And he said, well, what do you think you should do? I went, but I don't know, what should I do? Well, give me some ideas. What do you think you should do? Well, what might happen if you try that? And it was the first time I'd ever come across coaching, and it was utterly terrifying. And I think you have to make sure that you've got the context right for this, because if you're moving suddenly from being a task orientated directive leader into a sit back kind of asking questions kind of thing, you are going to discombobulate people.
100%.
So having the cultural framework for it as well is really important, so that people understand that this is you helping them, not absolving yourself of responsibility. So there is a really fine line, I think, and it's really important to get that context right.
And Heather, I totally agree. And therefore you might flip between the two. You might be
absolutely
directive, and then you might come back away to be more facilitating.
But
I think to start to do something different, even if you just ask one or two questions which are coach and then go back to being it'll be less obvious. So it's the understanding where you sit on the spectrum and how it comes across in being either directive or facilitating.
And Dave, you wanted to come in on that, Dave? Go on.
I was going to say, I think it's also helpful. Often when we're giving feedback and doing reviews, the mind of the person we're talking to is already set on what they think we're going to ask.
Yes.
And they're already a little bit fearful that we're going to ask them about performance. We're going to ask them about CVs out. We're going to ask them about a bid they've got, so something like that. And I think sometimes it's helpful if you can start that process by asking them or reminding them about their purpose. We talk a lot about purpose for organizations and purpose for leaders, but each of our staff will have their own purpose, the reason why they're working for the company. And if you can frame it by reminding them about what they're here for, what they're here to do, before you get into some of that more granular detail, I think that opens the conversation to be up for much more of a coaching style conversation than a manager consultant type conversation.
Dave, I think you're right. I think you're right. And I think that's where the lose tight framework comes to, because the tight piece at the beginning is making sure everybody's clear about what are the goals and aspirations, be it for the individual, for the career, for the organization, for the desk. So the beginning part of all of this is about setting it up properly in the first place, so that whatever you're reviewing and feeding back on, you've got your context for.
I think when we sort of look at it in that way, and it's a pleasure just listening to you sort of talk there, and just for the use of word of discombobulation, if I could actually say the word, it'd be great. That is just the whole topic for me. But when you start to think about this, what I always talk about when we talk about setting up the review, that what the manager's got to understand, that it's not the manager's review, it's a review of the person, and it's what that person is looking for. And what Paul was saying and Dave was saying, going in with preset ideas of what the conversation is going to be like generally fills people with dread, rather than what are they going to, what can I help, what can I do, and asking and turning the questions around to getting people to come back out with the answers is a very different style, but it means that people have got an opportunity to explore. And I think we started the conversation off by saying, what's in the past is in the past, and you can't change that. And that's what I always said at the beginning of every review, that I don't care what figures you've done, because I can't change those figures. All I can do is change what's happening in the here and now, which may potentially change the future. But it's the here and now that's going to change the future. And that here and now wasn't about me being dictatorial and being sort of aggressive with the person about why they haven't performed. it was actually understanding what their bottleneck was and how I could release the bottleneck. And so that asking the right questions to discover the bottleneck was the most important thing for me, because once I could find that, then I could release that, and then off they would go. And 9 times out of 10, the person would know what that bottleneck was. They just needed that sort of bit of encouragement and that bit of coaching and, you know, coaxing to actually take that.
I think, and it's also an acknowledgement that as managers and as leaders, we don't have all the answers. So we don't, you know, as well as that, getting individuals to work out where their bottlenecks are. If you look at things like Johari's window and stuff, the more you can help people to understand for themselves and work out for themselves why they performed well this week, and why, or areas in which they didn't perform well, the more they become self-aware of the things that impact their own performance, the more they're able to move that on to higher performance in the future. So it's moving beyond your job as a manager to teach somebody to do their job well. You're moving into, my job as a manager is to facilitate their own learning of how they do things.
Heather, I would just add something here, and that is, I think one of the things that makes a difference in these discussions is to avoid ambushing people, to give them time to prepare in advance. I think if you've been on the receiving end, as most of us have at some stage, of being ambushed by a manager, in other words, no prior understanding of what was going to come up in the conversation, it's pretty uncomfortable. Yeah. I think if you want to end up with as we all do, a constructive conversation, it's giving people some advance notice to think and look and prepare before the discussion. In that way, of course, there may be 2 different views, but at least you're going to have something that resembles a well thought through dialogue. And so I think that's an important thing. One of the things we talked about prior to, just as before we came on to the webinar, was we made reference to the thing in the news about the KPMG boss who's now had to step down because he got on a global webinar and used inappropriate language. I think he called it unconscious bias crap, I think was the expression used, and told everybody in uncertain terms they were lucky to have a job, and is now stepped down. Now, he may or may not have been right with his views, but it's the language he used that caused the problem. And I think that when you are applying yourself to, and I'd see that Simon Johnson has said on the chat box, I prefer to use check-in, catch-ups or updates rather than the term review. I think when we think about the use of language, it's very important to consider the impact it has on people. Inappropriate language, poorly constructed language can cause problems even before you sit down with somebody. But, you know, to think through very thoroughly how you phrase your conversation, how you frame your sentences is extremely important if you're going to get the most out of the dialogue.
Completely agree. For example, I really don't like the word appraisal, which is slightly unusual for a HR professional, but I think appraisals are has awful connotations of it, and there's much better language that you can use for what can be really valuable conversations. I think you're right. Use of language, use of setup, use of context is very important.
Even down to the actual setting, where you sit, how you sit, for example. You know, the old cartoons of the boss in a high chair behind a high desk with the employee sitting at the other side of the desk in a tiny little chair comes to mind. And I think, again, if you want to get a situation where you have an open environment, a family unit, then, you know, you look hard at where you're sitting and how you're sitting. I know at the moment we're virtual, but I mean, thinking forward to when we're all back in the office again, or at least partially, when we're having these one-on-ones physically, as it were, in the same room, where are we sitting? How is that going to come across? A lot of people now, for example, will sit down in coffee shops or used to anyway, when they used to open, but just to try to get things on an equal footing and allow that person to feel more relaxed, rather than demonstrating in a physical fashion that I'm in charge, you know, I'm a boss and I've got power. I think you want to try to equalize the environment to allow that individual to feel open and free and capable of speaking their thoughts without fear of recrimination.
I think a lot of that moves on to then, Paul, when we talk about some of the language that we use and what we do that, it's how we actually frame the questions that we ask our staff and our people, our peers, to open them up. And I think there's a very big difference. And certainly I've found that the managers who manage me and the managers who coach me, they had a very different style of questioning and they got far more out of me. So Heather, you were talking there about sort of, you remember sort of, you don't remember being a manager or how to be a manager. Now you've sort of learned how to be a coach. Talk about some of the things that you've changed and how you frame your questions and the difference in those questions, but what actually the knock-on and the ripple effects of those questions actually have.
Yeah, I think in the early days of learning to be a coach, I did struggle, and I did a lot of my learning to be a coach with phone coaching in the days before Zoom, because then you could see me like sitting on my hands and covering my face to try really not to interject and give people the answer, because when you've kind of done some of the things that you're coaching people on and you know the answers, there is this instinct to just tell them, to just tell people what the solution is, especially when they're describing a situation and there's a really obvious answer, and you kind of really want to do it. And what coaching taught me was to stop assuming that I know the answer, because I only know what that individual's telling me, not everything else that's going on in their head and not all the other context. And coaching taught me to sit back and listen and to ask more questions, to get more information from the individual, to enable them to reach their own decision. And there was actually an arrogance coming from my belief that I knew the answer. That was, sometimes it was founded, but more often than not wasn't, because I didn't understand all of the context. And so coaching changed the way I had conversations with people. And what it meant was that the people around me developed better skills. And I very quickly saw longer term benefits. So instead of people having to come repeatedly back to me for the same pieces of advice or the same situations, they were enabled to come up with the solutions for themselves. And you just build that better trust with individuals, that they aren't afraid to try things for themselves. Because what they know is when they come back to me, I'm not there to criticize. I'm there to say, okay, well, what went well? What didn't go quite so well? What could you have done differently? What would you have tried if you were to do it again? What have you learned from it? And actually, it meant the people around me became successful faster and with more confidence. People weren't afraid to try something new, and because they knew I had their backs.
Yeah, it's interesting, and that comment there, because they knew you had their back, means that as a coach rather than as a manager, you're actually helping this person to succeed rather than managing by the prescriptive numbers that most managers sort of get taught to manage by. You must look at this KPI, you must look at this, look at that. And I always remember the example when I started to go through this process as well, was the question was, a manager will ask, why are you late? Where a coach will ask, what's happened on the way to work?
Yes, it's great.
Yeah, which is a very different question, but the same answer would come. But how much more comfortable would you feel answering the second question, where the accusation on the first question is a very pointed accusation? And I think that was a sort of the realization to me that why haven't you hit target? Is another one sort of comes, why haven't you hit your KPI? Or what's held you back from hitting your KPIs? What could you have done differently? Is the same question, but you've added more to that question that makes the person feel comfortable. I could have done this, I could have done that, I could have done that. What's stopping you doing that then? What stopped you? What's prevented you? And I think the manager asks questions that give a very quick, pointed answer. The coach will ask a question that will lead to the bottleneck that they can then relieve. And I think there's a big difference when you start to talk about that and learning on that. Paul, we've worked together sort of collating and putting together a training course on reviews and framing questions, etc. I'm really interested in your views on questioning and how that works from your point of view.
I'm going to ask Heather a quick question in a second, or she can think about it, and then I'll sort of talk in between time. It's just I think we've briefly touched on it, and it's just that preparation before you sort of sit down and have a conversation. And so therefore I'm keen to understand what Heather thinks about, you know, what should that preparation look like, if any. I think what's worked well for me in the past is to have, you know, I think whether you call it a business review, career review, for personal development review, business review, I'm sort of sat on the fence in terms of whether that means much. I think the actual experience means much more than what the form's actually called, if I'm being brutally honest with you. That's not to say it shouldn't be called something that's, you know, a bit softer, but it's the experience. I think that the preparation that an individual does prior to sitting down and having a review is really important. I think having a framework, and of course, you know, we work in sales at the end of the day. So, you know, hard deliverables, you know, you can't ignore that at all. But balancing, it's not all about the deliverables. It's about how and the what. And I think that should take equal focus. So for me, it's a third on the results, a third on the how and the what, and then a third on behavior. Because we've talked a lot around how behavior is a key driver of culture and vice versa. And so therefore, we should be having conversations with our people about behavior. And, you know, a really good example, if you're not talking about behavior in your review, you know, process, then actually confronting it is quite hard, because it's like, well, you never told me my behavior was wrong, or you've never told me what good behavior looks like, or what the culture of this organization is. So I think splitting it into those thirds, third, gives a really nice balance, and it creates more autonomy, and you're facilitating much more than telling. But you're still not getting away from the fact that we've still got a job to do and we've still got deliverables to hit. But that comes back to the conversation and contracting in the right way from the onset, so people are aware of what we're trying to achieve or what needs to be achieved, and the consequences, or the, you know, what happens if we don't. And that's not from a, you know, you'll be out of a job. It's more, you know, the knock-on effect in terms of the team or the group or the business. Heather, any thoughts?
I think that's right, and I think that's what Tight Loose Tight is all about, Paul. It's that tight piece at the beginning is about being really upfront about what you're trying to achieve, what your aspirations are, what the purpose of the conversation is. There was a very big organisation that I won't name at the moment, but that some years ago their review process was described as being on the back of a fag packet. And they mocked up a review form that looked like a brand of cigarettes, because what they said was that it doesn't actually matter what the documentation looks like or the structure. What it matters is, as Dave was saying, what matters is what happens in the conversation. Yeah, that's the real value from this, is what happens in that conversation. How valuable is that conversation? And so I think that's absolutely crucial in getting this right. The kind of the on the back of a fag packet notes are all you need. In terms of recording, as long as you've set it up right and you understand, everybody's clear about what you're trying to achieve. The behaviours piece, Paul, thinks is absolutely vital. And we should always understand in and engage. We talk about belief engines and DNA and those things that we all believe. And that's really important, that we make sure, especially when you're developing people to become managers of the future, that they all understand that they are displaying the values that you all share as an organisation.
So there's two questions that want to come in. One, I'm going to go to Annette's second, Paul. So she's asked you a direct question, but Colin's asked a question here. With new starters with zero knowledge, the coaching questions are ineffective without knowledge. I'm presuming this is something that you move towards as you learn with people. And I think there's a belief that you should come in with set questions, and I've always thought that you have a set process and the questions come from the initial question that you ask and what goes from there. And I would look at that and saying the best reviews I've had sometimes haven't gone beyond that first question, because it's been such a big question, and the question normally with my first reviews is, how are you? Genuinely, how are you? And all of a sudden a whole different world comes up. So going in with knowledge of what their performance has been will help you to ask questions. But what we should be looking for is that everything else that helps drive performance, that's stopping them or helping them drive performance, they're the questions that we need to be sort of more aware of, because the data will only lead to so far. It's what they're physically doing. So those have to be spontaneous questions led by what the actual employee is saying to you, rather than having a prescriptive line and saying, I must go through all these questions and ask these type of questions. Because sometimes I never got past that first question because something was so out of kilter outside of work or inside of work, and that was the major block. And once I removed that, then it was sort of moved from there. So I think going in with knowledge is important, but understanding that knowledge isn't the part of the review. The review is about the person, and therefore that has to be almost, off cuff. But you'll get a bank of questions that you can start to rely on and work on to sort of help that. But it doesn't need to be prescriptive, as Colin's sort of almost suggesting there.
Well, I think with trainees, there is, of course, a need to teach them some things. There are some things they have to know and learn, and there is some knowledge you have to impart to them. But there is also real value in coaching them to work some of this stuff out for themselves, rather than just telling. So there is less of a balance. The balance will shift as somebody becomes more and more experienced. But even with a trainee, the first time I did a disciplinary meeting, I was sent into the disciplinary meeting with no previous understanding of what I was doing. And then I came out and my manager reviewed with me, well, how did that go? What do you think you could have done differently? So you would never presume to say, I could have done it without instruction. Well, I did. And then I learned from it. And I think, I do think with trainees, there are some things we have to teach them, input, but there are lots of things that we can facilitate them learning for themselves that will be more powerful.
And I think that's the difference between having that review, or as you're calling it, a career review or a career conversation, where you're discovering where their strengths are and where their gaps are. Then you move into a training session after that, where I think a lot of managers will instantly jump on the first opportunity they have and then ram that training down their throat during that review, and they don't actually get anything else from that review point of view. So it's understanding where you discover this is the gap. Then you put that training to the side of that and say, right, we can put that's a note that I have to deliver to you after this session. Let's carry on with the review. The second question came from Annette, was, could Paul elaborate on why he's tight? Elaborate on how and what in the context of a third and a third and a third.
Yeah, absolutely. And Annette, a public thank you for all the support you've given us on LinkedIn with your kind comments. Let me explain the why first. So I ran a pulse survey for a client just before Christmas, and throughout doing that process, it then transpired that people felt the review process wasn't adding value in the right ways. So I wouldn't encourage anybody to go off changing things unless there's a need, first and foremost. Otherwise, people think you're just changing stuff for changing its sake. So I helped an agency change their review process because of what the people had told us in the pulse survey, and we changed the format. So a third of it was focusing on the results. So this is the hard data. This is the whether you call them KPIs, objectives, goals. It's all the measurable things that you would need to understand whether somebody was building in the right way. The second bit is about how they found it, what's worked, what's not worked, what they found easy, what they found hard, what they need more support with, what they need less support with. And then the third, with this particular client, we re-engineered the vision for the company. And then through re-engineering the vision, we rewrote the values, and we brought the values down into specific behaviors, or I did. And the behaviors are all now aligned to the values which are on the review form. And that's part of what is talked about on at least a quarterly basis now. Is the behaviours. So I hope that helps. But if you need anything else, Annette, just drop me a line and I'll give you a call at some point this afternoon. Dave, I don't know whether you've got anything else to add to that, just in terms of quickly about that review process.
I think we've covered it really well. I go back to ensure as a leader, as a coach, whatever language we use, that you understand the individuals that you're talking to, you understand their purpose. Because I just feel that helps the conversation go well. And to the point about motivating, ideally you want to come out of that meeting, both of you, feeling motivated, particularly for the employee. If you're the leader of your business, you want your employees to be motivated. But as a leader, you also want that sense of motivation that your staff, that your employee are on the right track. And that's important for both of you, because then you're both succeeding, and then the business will drive better performance.
So let's flip very quickly onto the last question, because we're getting very short on time here. The last question is the review process, how it should motivate staff. So let's very quickly talk about how the review process then should motivate staff.
Who's going to go?
I'll go if you
Mr.
like.
Jacobs. Mr.
Okay,
Jacobs.
I'm very happy to take that up. Actually, just before we get there, one of the things I just wanted to ask, or even just talk about, coming back to Colin's question, onboarding new staff at the moment is challenging. There's no question about that. I have a lot of clients who have taken on staff over the last 6 months, and these people, often people with no recruitment experience, are having to try to learn how to be a consultant whilst still sitting in their bedrooms or their dining rooms, and it's very difficult. And I've had innumerable conversations with my clients about how we induct those people. And I think it comes down to, Heather, perhaps you can chip in here. I think, coaching people remotely is not an easy thing. One of the things that I think we all remember when we started in our jobs in recruitment was just being in an office and being aware of, if you like, the noise around us, soaking up what people were saying, subconsciously grabbing hold of expressions and techniques that somehow came out of our own mouths a bit further down the line. You learn so much just by being in the middle of that scrum, and that kind of soak it up. And I think, unfortunately, at the moment, people are denied that opportunity, and that puts a lot of pressure on the manager to coach that person from a distance. My advice has been, and it's been this way all the way through this pandemic, it's you have to heighten the level of communication. It means a lot more conversations, a lot more video discussions, and so forth. And I think there's very little that you can do, unfortunately, beyond that, simply because you can't at the moment sit down with somebody physically in the same room. I don't know if you've had the similar experiences where you've been working, Heather, and have you any other tips or techniques that might help Colin around this?
Yeah, absolutely. We've had those experiences. We've had people who have joined us during the last year who have never met any of their teammates face to face, who are now incredibly successful consultants, but who have never met their colleagues. So it's entirely possible. I think it is harder with trainees than it is with people who are more experienced. One of the things we found really helpful is to use apps like House Party. So I don't know if you've come across House Party.
Yep.
It's a great one to just have on a phone at the side of you, open. People can drop in the same way they kind of drop by your desk. So you can have people drop in and have conversations, and you can get that kind of sense of sociability with House Party being open. The other thing we've done is leave a Teams call or a Zoom call open for trainees. So it's open all day with their manager, or for 2 or 3 hours in the morning and 2 or 3 hours in the afternoon. So people again can call in, so that you're hearing them making calls live
That's a good idea.
on an open Zoom call. That's worked really well for us. And we've done that with support services as well. So we'll have support services, we'll have an open Zoom call or an open Teams room. They publicize those details, and then people can just drop in when they've got a question about how the CRM works, or a question about dealing with a purchase order or an invoice. So that kind of drop-in centre being open regularly has really helped. But you're absolutely right. Communication, coaching becomes ever more important. The other thing we do is pick the phone up instead of Zoom calls. So mixing it up a bit. It's exhausting spending all of your time on Zoom calls and face to face. So actually just occasionally picking the phone up and saying, how's it going? And not talking to them about work and performance and learning, but just saying, how's your day been? Have you been able to get outside? Have you gone for a walk? Have you, just mixing it up a little bit with different forms of communication.
I think those are brilliant tips. I love the open Zoom call idea. It's a fantastic idea. If Colin's still listening, maybe that's something that could be done there as well. To come back to Howard's question, so if you're asking what would I expect the outcome to be from a whatever we're going to call it, a review meeting, a conversation, the objective for me as the appraisor would be that I would want that person to be feeling pumped up, re-energized, to have a very clear understanding of what is expected of them. I think certainly, as Paul said correctly, we're in the business of results. So, it isn't a question necessarily about some of the more, I wouldn't say trivial things, but about attendance and so forth. It is about results. So certainly stretch targets will always enter into that conversation, but I want people to be leaving any conversation I have with them from a review perspective with a firm belief that they can achieve. I also want them to, I suppose, be aware of what they need to do to improve their performance, whether that is through L&D, whether they're going to do that on their own or whether we're going to provide coaching and support for them. And I certainly expect them to be aware of the areas where they need to demonstrate improvement. But above all, I want their morale to lift. I want them to have a firm belief that we took them on for a reason. We took them on because we had a great belief that they would be successful. And I guess this is an opportunity to reaffirm that, to give them that sense of purpose again, bolster their confidence. And I think that's especially important at the moment when we think and talk about, as we often do, looking after people's mental well-being, making sure that, as you said earlier, how are you doing, looking after them. I think it's very difficult for some people to maintain that level of optimism and self-belief when they're on their own. And we've got the daily Groundhog Day scenario that we all go through. And I think it's important as coaches to be mindful of that when we have reviews. But above all, I think it's absolutely to get people moving again in the right direction and feeling that they're capable of achieving what they join the business to do.
I think that review process needs to be that positive process, that they feel that they're getting something out of it. And I think the problem with a lot of reviews, and especially with working remotely, is that a lot of reviews are cancelled, but then the training and development that should come out of those reviews are also not happening. And I think that's where the manager and the coach has got to really take control, is that they need to make sure that review becomes regimented within the calendar so they know it's happening. They need to make sure that it is a positive review, but also the things that come out of that, as in coaching, developing and mentoring, also start to happen more and more. That means, as in Heather's conversation there, they know that you've got their back. That becomes the norm, that you're helping them develop and you're putting everything that you can to remove all bottlenecks. That's when people start to get motivated, when they feel that they are being developed, they feel that they have the autonomy, they feel that someone is supporting them. That's when they start to really sort of step up a little bit and move from there.
And alongside that, making sure that always the outcomes are owned by the individual.
Yes.
So one of the biggest mistakes I think the manager makes is that they take ownership for whatever the development activities are going to be, and then they're too busy and they don't happen. The individual should always own the next steps in seeking out the development and in making it happen.
I agree with that. I'd also say one other thing that's important that came up quite recently with another client was that I think you've got to get it all out there on the table. There is no point in thinking at the end of whatever we call it, a review, that we didn't discuss a particularly difficult subject. I mean, one way or another, things have to be tackled. Of course, choosing the right language, positive language is important, but to exit a discussion for either party thinking, I've still got stuff I didn't say is not what you want. You need to get it all out there and cover it all off. To Howard's point, sometimes that means you can't get much beyond the first one or two points. But I think, you want to finish it feeling that's it. We've all vented. We've all said what we wanted to say. And now, as you say, we're moving forward positively and the individual owns the actions. And I think that's absolutely where you want to be.
I think it's interesting on that, Paul, as we sort of try to wrap up, you know, them owning their actions and the managers owning their actions and their input into the success of the person is really important. And I think that is where that, you know, relationship between manager and employee becomes really important, and how you develop that. If they feel that they have a true relationship with that person and that person is generally trying to do the best for them, then it starts to really sort of move forward. So Heather, I'd like to thank you for your time. It's been a very enlightening webinar as always. We've just put a video out, or Paul Sharp's just put a video out about what we've done in our, is it 163 days, Paul?
Something like that, yeah.
163 days, and what we've actually done in 63 days. And I think one of the points we put in that video was that we'd run over on our webinars at least 17 times. I think that's now 18 times because we've run over by another 5 minutes. I'm not too sure whose fault that was. Probably mine for not controlling it from there. So I'll take that from a review point of view, and I will chastise myself properly, but then look at the gap, and the gap was probably someone talking too much. But there we go. But there. So have a look at the video on LinkedIn. You know, Paul Sharp spent some time trying to get his Star Wars app working, which frustrated him. And all of us on Saturday, as he texted us 100,000 times on how to do it, but he got it done eventually. But it's a really interesting comment. You know, we'd like to thank everyone that's been on our webinars. We look forward to next week's webinar. And next week, we're going to talk about, again, using data that you can pull from your CRM and from your thing to help improve your consultants' performance. And there's lots of hidden data that can help drive your consultants' performance and use them part of the reviews, but use it in a wise way and stuff like that. So again, we've got one of our partners coming in and helping us that, and they'll help us how to sort of draw that and what information people are using from all over the place. So feel free to join us. So again, Heather, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure today. Much appreciated. Ladies and gents who've attended, thank you very much for attending. I hope you've enjoyed the session. We look forward to seeing you next week. Paul, Dave and Paul, have a super day, and we'll see you all next week. Thank you very much.
Guys, take care,
guys.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.